If I could sit down with the man I was at 70, I'd be looking at a fellow who has 3 years left with his wife and hasn't the faintest idea. I'm Walter, 82, retired carpenter, 9 years on my own since I lost my Helen. If there's still somebody in your house, you're the man I'd actually be talking to. Start with number 1 and stay for number 4 because that's whether I'd tell him. Number 1, I'd tell him to get in that kitchen and learn to cook, starting Tuesday. At 70, I could not cook. That's the plain fact. I could do eggs and I could do toast, and that was the whole of my range at 70 years of age. Helen cooked. She cooked for 51 years by then, and it was simply the arrangement, and neither of us had ever examined it once. So here's what actually happened. She died in October of 2017, and I was 73 years old, and I had to learn to cook in the worst year of my life, from nothing, alone, in her kitchen. I was terrible at it. I've said so before. There was a stew that first winter you could have patched a roof with, and a chicken I'd rather not discuss, and I set off the smoke alarm 4 times in a house a mile from anything. But that's not why I'd tell him. I'd tell him because of what he'd have got instead. 3 years of standing in that kitchen next to her while she showed him. 3 years of her being the one who knew and him being the one who didn't, which she'd have enjoyed enormously and which I'd have grumbled about the whole time. That's 3 years of a woman in a good mood teaching her husband something, and I traded it for eggs and toast. If you're walking this road alone, subscribe, so you don't have to walk it alone. All right, number 2, and before I get to it, one more thing about that kitchen, because I'd not have understood it at 70 at all. When I finally did learn, in that first bad winter, every single thing I got wrong at her stove with nobody to ask. And the thought that arrived every time was the same one. She'd have done this without looking. That's a rotten way to learn anything. If I'd started at 70, she'd have been standing right there, and being wrong would have been a joke between 2 people instead of a man alone at a stove at 73 feeling like a fool. Now, I'd tell him to record her voice. I have not got one. Not 1 second of it. I want to be exact about this because it's the thing I'd shake that man by the collar over. In 2014, I had a telephone in my pocket that could have recorded her reading a shopping list, and I never once did it, and I could have done it 1,000 times. Here's why it matters, and here's the part nobody warns you about. Her voice went first. Somewhere in the 3rd year, I was in the shop and I made a bad cut, and I went to remember a thing she always said when I did that. She had about a dozen phrases that were entirely hers. And I had the words and I could not hear it. The words were there. The sound was gone. I stood at that bench and tried to get it back for a good while. The way it went up at the end, the particular dry amusement she put on it. It would not come, and it has not come since. That's what I'd tell the man at 70. The face lasts. You've got photographs, and photographs hold a face perfectly well. There is nothing anywhere in that house that holds a voice. Now, I did what I could about it, and I'll tell you, because somebody watching is already past this and can't record anybody. I started a notebook, hardbound, in the drawer of the desk in the front room, and I started it in that 3rd winter in a state of some panic. I wrote down every phrase of hers I could still get. Got 11 that first evening and sat there feeling as though I'd been robbed. The other 50 arrived one at a time over 4 years. Standing at a sink, out in the shop, halfway through a Tuesday. And I'd put down whatever I was holding and go and write it before it went again. 60 odd now. My granddaughter Lily gets that notebook and she knows it. But 60 phrases in my handwriting is not her voice. And I'd trade the lot for 11 seconds of a shopping list. So if there's somebody in your house, record them. Today, not on some occasion, not a speech. Get them talking about nothing at all, about the weather or what wants doing at the weekend, and keep it somewhere you'll find it. You will never in your life be glad you didn't. And I'd say something about the photographs because I've got a good many, and they've taught me something I did not expect. A photograph gives you a moment. That's all it does, and it does it well. What it does not give you is the ordinary. There is not one photograph in this house of Helen doing anything she did every day. Not one of her at that sink. Not one of her coming across the yard to the shop door. Not one of her sitting on the edge of that bed, putting her stockings on, which she did about 19,000 times, and which I can see perfectly, and which will go out of the world when I do. Everything I've got a photograph of is an occasion. Weddings, Christmases, the children's birthdays, a trip to Bar Harbor in 1989, and it turns out that a marriage is almost entirely made of the other stuff. So I'd tell the man at 70, photograph the ordinary. Take one of her at the stove with her back to you. Take one of her reading in that chair with the lamp on. She'll tell you to stop it and to take one when she's done her hair, and take it anyway. Because in 9 years' time, the man holding those photographs is going to have plenty of her in a good dress and none at all of her in the kitchen on a Wednesday. And it's the Wednesdays he'll want. Now, there's a harder version of this, and it's the useful part. At 70, I did not believe any of this would ever be needed. That's the real problem, and it isn't laziness. A man of 70 with a wife of 68 in good health cannot make himself believe in his body that there will be a version of that house with one person in it. He can say it. Of course, one of us will go first, and it's words with nothing behind them, so I'd not ask him to believe it. I'd ask him to do the small things anyway, as a formality, the way you'd sign a form you don't expect to need. Record her voice. Photograph a Wednesday. Ask her the questions you'd ask a stranger you found interesting. Where she was actually happiest. What she'd have done if she hadn't married a carpenter. What her mother said to her the week before the wedding. I don't know the answer to any of those three. 54 years and I don't know, and there is nobody left to ask. And both her sister and her mother are gone as well. That's what I'd put in front of him. Not a warning. A short list of things that cost him an afternoon and that he'd have for the rest of his life. Before the next one, tell me in the comments what one sentence you'd send back to yourself 10 years ago. Just the sentence. I'd like to read those, and I think a good many other people would too. I read every single comment, and I answer as many as these old hands allow. Number 3. I'd tell him that the friends are hers, and he's going to need his own. At 70, I'd have said we had a good many friends. That was true, and it was also not quite true in the way that mattered. Every one of those friendships was maintained by Helen. She rang people. She remembered what was going on in their lives. She arranged the suppers and she wrote at Christmas, and she was the one who said we ought to have the so-and-sos over. And I said, all right, and I turned up in a clean shirt and enjoyed myself and took no part whatever in how any of it happened. 54 years of that, and I genuinely believed I was a man with friends. Then she died, and inside about 18 months I found out what I actually had, which was 2 children and a telephone. I want to be fair to those people, because none of them abandoned me. They tried. Elaine down the road tried for the better part of a year before I ever said yes to a cup of coffee. But the whole machinery of it had been hers, and when it stopped, I did not know how to start it, because I had never once started anything in 54 years. At 70, I could have learned. There was a man I'd worked alongside on and off for 30 years named Bob, and I could have rung that man on a Tuesday for no reason, and I never did it once in 3 decades. He died at 78, 4 years after she did. And I'd tell the man at 70-something about the men in particular, because I've watched it happen more than once on this road. We do not have friends the way our wives have friends. We have men we've done things alongside, work, or a boat, or a job that lasted 2 years. Take away the thing and there's no arrangement left, because the arrangement was the thing. I knew a fellow named Frank. Lost his wife 4 years before I lost Helen. Same town, near enough the same age and the same trade. And Frank pulled in, quietly, reasonably, over about 2 years, and every step of it looked sensible from inside. He died at 76, and it was a while before anybody knew. That's what I'd put in front of the man at 70. Not go and make friends, because he'd have laughed at me. I'd say, ring Bob on a Tuesday, once a month, for nothing. Because a habit of ringing a man for nothing is the only thing that survives losing the reason you knew him. And I'd give him the arithmetic because the arithmetic is the part that would have got through to a carpenter. At 70, I'd have said, perhaps a dozen people in my life outside the family. 9 years later, I've got 5. And I'll tell you where the others went, because it wasn't dramatic. 2 died. Bob and another fellow I'd known since the 60s. That's simply the arithmetic of being 82, and there's nothing to be done about it. From here on, the number only goes one way, and every man my age knows it. 2 moved. 1 to New Hampshire to be near a daughter, 1 to Florida, and both of them meant to keep in touch, and both of them are decent men, and neither of us has managed it. And the rest, 5 or 6 people, thinned out for no reason at all. Nobody fell out with anybody. They were Helen's arrangements, and when Helen stopped, the arrangement stopped, and about 18 months went by before I noticed. So a dozen went to 5 and 9 years, and only 2 of those losses were death. Which means the other 5 were preventable, and I was the man who could have prevented them, and I did not know that was a job that needed doing. That's what I'd put in front of the man at 70. Not sentiment, a number. You've got 12, and you'll have 5. And 4 of the 7 you lose are going to go, because nobody rang anybody. Now, I'd tell him one more thing about this, and it's the piece I only worked out about 3 years ago. He needs somebody who is in it with him. I've got 5 people, and every one of them does a different job. My son rings on a Sunday, and he's the only person alive who's known me the whole way through. My daughter notices she'll hear something in my voice from 200 miles off that I can't hear standing in my own kitchen. My granddaughter writes letters and brings the new into this house. Elaine down the road is half a mile away and has a key. And then there's Marie. Marie was married to Bob. She's 9 years into the same business I'm in, and we have lunch about once a month and have done for years. And with Marie, I don't have to manage anything. That's the whole of what she's for, and there's nobody else who can do it. With my children, I curate. I give them an honest version, but it's a version because a father does not hand his children the worst of it. With Elaine, we talk about the road. With Marie, if I say the house was bad last week, she says, yes, February. And that's the entire conversation, and it's complete. The man at 70 has no idea he'll need that. He'd think it morbid. And I'd tell him that the person who will do that job for him is very probably somebody he already knows and has never once had a proper conversation with. The wife of a man he works alongside, somebody at the church, somebody 2 doors down. Look around now, I'd say. One of them is going to be the most important person in your life in about 12 years, and neither of you knows it yet. And I'd add the practical form because look around is not an instruction a man can act on. Say yes to 1 thing a month that you'd normally decline. That's the whole of it. At 70, I declined nearly everything that wasn't family, and I had a reason every time, and the reasons were all true. The drive, the hour, the fact that I'd have been the only one there without a trait in common. Every one of those declines cost me a person I have not got now. You don't know which yes is the one that matters. That's the trouble with it. 12 of them a year, for 10 years, and perhaps 2 turn into something, and there is no way whatever to tell in advance which 2. So you say yes 12 times a year, and you write off the other 10, and that's the price. And at 82, I'd call it the cheapest thing I ever failed to buy. Number 4 now, and this is the one I promised you, the 3 years. Remember I said number 4 is whether I'd tell him? Here it is, and the answer is no. And it took me a long while to get there. Let me lay out what he's looking at, so you understand the size of the thing. That man at 70 has 1,000 and some days left with his wife. She's out in the garden as we speak, in the bed along the south side, and she has got about 3 years, and he thinks he has got 20. And I know the date. I know the room. I know what the light was doing that morning. Now, every part of me wants to say it. There is not a man alive who wouldn't want to say it. But I've turned it over for 9 years, and here's where I've come out. If I told him, I would take those 3 years away from him. Not extend them. Take them. because a man who knows spends the whole of it watching a clock. He does not have 3 years of a marriage. He has 3 years of a countdown, and there is no dinner and no June morning and no ordinary Tuesday in that house that would not have had the number sitting on top of it. He'd have been unbearable. He'd have gone strange, and she'd have known something was wrong, and she'd have asked, and he could not have told her, and the two of them would have spent 3 years in a house with a thing in it that neither of them could name. I'd have ruined it. I'm as certain of that as I am of anything. So no, I'd not tell him, but I'd tell him 2 words, and the 2 words do more than the date would. Turn around. That's it. That's the whole of it, and I'd say it to him until he was sick of hearing it. Here's what I mean, and it's an ordinary thing that happened perhaps 400 times. I'd be out in the shop, and she'd come across the yard and stand in that doorway, and she'd say something. Nothing much. What she was thinking about for supper, or that so-and-so had rung, or just a remark about the weather she'd made, half to herself. And I'd answer her without turning round, with a plane in my hand, over my shoulder, still working. Yes, right. All right then. 400 times near enough. 9 years of retirement in that shop, and a woman who came across the yard to talk to me. And I'd give a very great deal to have turned around for one of them. That's what I'd say to the man at 70. Not she's gonna die. Just when she comes to that door, put the tool down and turn around. Because the date would have poisoned the 3 years, and the 2 words would have improved every one of those 400 moments, and he'd never once have known why he was doing it. That's the whole answer to number 4. I'd not give him the knowledge. I'd give him the behavior and let him wonder at the strange old fellow who insisted on it. And I'd tell him this, which is the same thing said another way. Whatever you are saving up to do with her later, there isn't a later. Not that you'd notice. There is only a Tuesday in October where you find out that all of it has already happened. He wouldn't understand that. Nobody at 70 understands that, but he might have turned round. Now, I've had this argued with me, and I'll put the other side because it's a fair one. My daughter thinks I'd tell him. She said so at that kitchen table about 2 years ago. She said, "Pop, you say that now, but if you were actually sitting across from him, you'd tell him inside of a minute." She may be right. I'd not swear to it. It's an easy thing to be noble about when the man doesn't exist. But here's what I said back to her, and I still hold it. I've watched people who did know. Bob knew. He had a diagnosis, and he had about 14 months, and they told him at the start roughly what he was looking at, and I saw that man perhaps 20 times in those 14 months. And I'll tell you what I saw. And I've never said this to Marie, and I never will. He was not present for it. He was somewhere out ahead of himself the whole time, doing arithmetic. Every conversation had a second conversation going on underneath it about how many were left. He'd be sitting in a room with the people who loved him, and he'd be somewhere in November. I don't blame him. I have absolutely no idea what I'd have done, and I'd not judge a man for it. But that is the thing knowing does, and I watched it do it. And I would not hand it to a man who is presently out in his shop on an ordinary Tuesday with his wife in the garden. There's a second reason, and it's smaller, and I think it's truer. The 3 years were good. That's what people miss when they hear this. Those were not 3 years of me failing to appreciate my wife. 2014 to 2017 was one of the better stretches of the whole marriage. I'd been retired 9 years by then. The children were grown and doing well. Neither of us was ill. And we got to the part where 2 people who've been married that long have stopped performing at each other entirely. We ate at that table every night. We had the fire. She had the garden and I had the shop, and we came together at about 5 o'clock, and neither of us was managing anybody. That is a good 3 years. I'd not improve on it much, even knowing what I know. So the notion that I'd have transformed it with the information is, I think, mostly wrong. What I'd have done is put a weight on it. The only thing I genuinely change is the doorway, which is why the 2 words are the whole of my advice. And I want to say what turning around would actually have been, because I've made it sound like a gesture, and it isn't. She was not coming out to that shop to tell me about supper. That's what I thought at the time. 9 years I thought that. She came across the yard perhaps 400 times in 9 years of retirement, and what she was doing, and I'd bet the house on this now, was coming to be with me for a minute. The supper was the reason she'd give herself. Every one of those trips was a woman crossing a yard because her husband was out there and she wanted to be where he was for a minute, and every single one of them got answered over a shoulder by a man who did not put his tool down. That is the thing I'd take back out of 82 years, and it isn't a dramatic thing, and there's no scene attached to it. 400 small refusals I did not know I was making. She never once mentioned it. Not in 9 years. That's the part that gets me at 3 in the morning occasionally. She came out 400 times and got answered over her shoulder 400 times, and she never said a word about it. And she came again the next week. That's what a good wife looks like, and I'd not have recognized it at 70. And I'd say the 2 words to anybody watching who's still got somebody, because it generalizes and it costs nothing. Whatever your version of that doorway is, find it. It's the place where they come to you and you're in the middle of something. It might be a shop or a desk or a garden or a chair with the television on. It's the moment where they say a small thing and you answer without stopping. Everybody's got one. Most people have never noticed it, the same as I never noticed mine in 9 years. And they are not coming to tell you the thing they're telling you. That's the whole discovery. The thing is a reason. They're coming to be where you are for a minute, which is the plainest form of love there is, and the one that gets answered over a shoulder in about 100 million houses tonight. Put the tool down, that's all. You'll not find out for years whether it mattered, and it does. And there is no arrangement on this earth by which I can go back and find that out for myself. Number 5, I'd tell him he's going to be all right, and I'd tell him exactly where it gets bad, because that's the part that would actually help. Here's what that man is most afraid of, and he'd not say it out loud to anybody, including himself. He is afraid of ending up as an old man alone in that house. It's the thing he'd not look at directly. And if you'd shown him a photograph of me, 82, in that chair, in a house with nobody in it, he'd have found it unbearable. So the first thing I'd tell him is, that's me, and I'm all right. Not fine in the way people say fine. All right. There's work on the bench most mornings. There's a fire in the evening. There are 5 people I speak to every week, and I know all their names, and they know mine. I sleep through most nights now, which I did not do for 2 years. I've had a decent 9 years, taken as a whole, and I'd not have believed a word of that at 70, but I'd not leave it there, because that's the sort of comfort that's no use to anybody. I'd tell him the 3rd year is the worst one. Everybody warns you about the first. The first is dreadful, and it is also the one where the world shows up. There were people in this house for a week after the funeral, and food on that counter I hadn't cooked, and the phone rang constantly. By the 3rd year, all of that has gone, quite properly, and everybody has got on with their lives. And you have quietly stopped giving yourself permission to be struggling, because it's been 3 years and you ought to be past it. That's the year I nearly went under, and not one person knew, because I answered the telephone pleasantly every single time it rang. So I'd take him by the shoulder and say, in the 3rd year, tell somebody it's still hard. That's all. It'll feel ridiculous. Say it anyway. And then I'd tell him the last thing. I'd tell him he's going to go on talking to her every night at the lamp on his own side of a bed they had for 46 years. Out loud most nights. Good night, Helen. 9 years and it has not stopped. And I have stopped expecting it to. He'd think that was a sad thing to hear. He'd think it was the description of a man who hadn't managed. It isn't. It's the arrangement, and it works. And it's the reason I get up in the morning in a house she chose the windows for. And I'd tell him the rest of what's coming, because a man ought to know the shape of a thing. The 1st year you'll be carried, and he shouldn't mistake that for how it's going to be. 40 people show up. There's food on the counter you didn't cook. Men you've not spoken to in 15 years stand in your kitchen not knowing what to say and say it anyway. Then it thins, which is right and proper, and I'd have done the same. And then there's the stretch I've told you about. And on the other side of it, something happens that he would never believe. It gets good again. Not the same. There's a version of this that's a lie, and I'll not tell it. The life I have now is smaller than the one I had, and there's a hole in the middle of it that does not close. But the mornings are good. I'm up at 5:15 and there's a fire I lay the night before, and I sit at that table with her green cup and watch it get light on a row of cedars she picked out in 1971 over my objection. And that is not endurance. That's a good hour, and I have one every day. There's work on that bench. Right now it's a chest of drawers for Susan that she doesn't know about, and there's a third drawer to fit in the morning, and I am looking forward to it in the way a man looks forward to things. I'd say to him, "You're going to be 79 years old before any of that comes back." And it does come back, and you'd better hold on for it. Now, the last thing, and it's what I'd actually say if I only got one sentence. I'd tell him not to be frightened of me, because that's what he is. That fellow at 70 is frightened of the old man at the end of this. The one alone in the house at the end of the driveway with nobody coming. He'd have looked at me and seen the worst thing he could imagine. And I'm sitting here. I'm 82, and my hands still work. And I know the name of every person who will ring me this week, and I have a fire going and a drawer to fit. The thing he's frightened of is me, and I'm all right. That's the whole of the letter, if you boil it down. Learn to cook, record her voice, ring Bob, turn round when she comes to that door, and don't be frightened of the man at the other end, because he made it, and he's not miserable, and he'd not swap places with anybody who hadn't had those 54 years. I'd want him to hear that last part, particularly. He got the 54 years. That's the thing to hold on to. There are men who never got 4, and men who got 54 bad ones. And he got 54 good ones with a woman who came across a yard 400 times to stand in a doorway. You cannot lose a thing that good without it costing you afterward. The cost is the receipt. If it hadn't cost me, it wouldn't have been worth having, and I'd not want a version of my life where losing her was manageable. And there's one more thing I'd put to him, standing up on the way out. He's going to spend a good deal of those 3 years thinking about the future, about the house, about what wants doing to it, about whether they ought to see more of the country while they still can. We talked about Nova Scotia for about 6 years, never went. I'd not tell him to go to Nova Scotia. That's the sort of advice that ends up on a fridge magnet. I'd tell him that the future he's planning is not the one arriving, which is true for every man who ever lived and is not a reason to stop planning. What it is a reason for is this: don't put the good part at the end of the plan. We were saving the trip for when the roof was done and the shop was cleared out and the money was right. And the roof got done and the money was right, and by then there was no trip to take. Whatever the good part is, put it in the middle. Do it while the roof is still bad. Now, I've said all that, and I've thought about the whole business more than is good for a man, and I'll finish with the honest part. He wouldn't have listened. That's the truth of it. I know that fellow. He was 70 years old, and he'd been right about most things for a long while, and he'd got there by not taking anybody's advice. He'd have heard me out politely, because he was a polite man, and he'd have gone back out to the shop and got on with what he was doing. That's what I'd have done at 70, and I'd not pretend otherwise. So the letter's no use to him. Learn to cook. Record her voice. Ring Bob on a Tuesday. Turn around when she comes to the door. And in the 3rd year, tell somebody 5 things, and the man therefore cannot hear them, which is why I've said them to you instead. If there's somebody in your house tonight, go and do the 2 words. That's all I'd ask. You'll not know for years whether it mattered, and it will. If what stayed with you was the 3rd year, if you're in it now, or you can feel it coming. I made another talk about exactly that, about why the 1st year isn't the hard one, and what the 3rd one takes from you. It's right there on the screen. The kettle's still warm. I'll see you there.